Imagine stepping into a house, only to realize it's been waiting for you. A dark presence, a twisted truth, and a terrifying encounter that will haunt your every thought. Can you handle the truth that lurks behind these walls? What happens when the horror you thought was only a nightmare becomes your reality? Stay till the end. This is one story you'll never forget if you dare to know what happens next. The house was quiet. Too quiet. A single lamp flickered in the corner of the room. Its light cast eerie shadows on the peeling wallpaper. The air smelled stale, a mix of damp wood and old cigarettes. Somewhere in the distance, a clock ticked. Tick, tick, tick. Laura stood frozen at the door, her hand trembling on the doorknob. The police tape was torn, hanging limp against the frame. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not alone. But the note had said otherwise. Come at midnight. Come alone. I'll tell you the truth. Her breath hitched as she stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath her feet. The house seemed to groan in protest. The living room was just as they'd left it the night they found the body. A shattered coffee table. Dark stains on the carpet. The scent of something metallic, faint but unmistakable, lingered. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning for movement, for anything out of place. She swore she heard something. A shuffle. A whisper. No one's here, she told herself. But her gut said otherwise. The note was clutched tightly in her hand, crumpled and damp with sweat. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, almost manic. Each word burned in her mind. You're next. The kitchen door creaked open slowly. Too slowly. Laura's heart pounded in her chest, loud enough to drown out her thoughts. Her fingers grazed the cold surface of the wall, searching for a light switch. It clicked, but nothing happened. The bulb above her head sputtered once, twice, and then went dark. Her breathing quickened as she turned to face the kitchen. A faint glimmer caught her eye. A knife on the counter. The blade gleamed in the moonlight, smeared with something dark. Her stomach twisted. She took a step closer. And then she saw it. A handprint on the refrigerator door. Bloody. Fresh. Her body stiffened. The hairs on her neck stood on end. Something moved behind her. A shadow. She spun around, her voice caught in her throat. The door slammed shut. And then came the sound. A slow, deliberate breath. Right behind her. Laura froze. Her legs felt heavy like lead. The breath was too close. She could feel it, warm and damp, brushing the back of her neck. Her pulse hammered in her ears, drowning out every other sound. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing closer with every passing second. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her body wouldn't obey. Behind her, the breathing grew louder, ragged, uneven. And then it stopped. The silence was worse. It was suffocating, thick with the weight of the unknown. She tightened her grip on the note, crumpling it further. It made the faintest crackle. Too loud. Far too loud. She could feel the presence now. Looming. Watching. Her skin crawled, a cold sweat trickling down her spine. Slowly, painfully, she turned her head. The shadows shifted. Something or someone moved just out of sight. A faint glint of eyes caught the moonlight. But they weren't human. They were too wide, too still. She stumbled backward, her foot catching on the edge of the carpet. Her body hit the floor with a dull thud. The sound echoed through the empty house. And then it started. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Each step closer than the last. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she scrambled backward, her palms scraping against the rough carpet. The footsteps stopped, right in front of her. She couldn't look up. She wouldn't. But she could feel it, towering over her, watching. A cold hand reached out, brushing against her arm. She screamed. The sound tore from her throat, raw and desperate. And then the lights flickered on. The room was empty. No shadows. No eyes. No hand. Just the knife on the counter. And the bloody handprint. Except now there were two. Laura's hands trembled as she stared at the second handprint. It wasn't there before. She knew it wasn't. The blood was fresh, glistening in the dim light. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, her chest rising and falling in jagged, uneven bursts. The air felt heavier now, like it was closing in on her. She rose to her feet, her legs shaky, barely able to hold her weight. The knife on the counter seemed to glint at her, almost mocking. Her instinct screamed to grab it, but she hesitated. What if it wasn't alone? What if it was still here? Her eyes darted around the room, scanning every corner, every shadow. The kitchen was still, too still. But then came the sound, a soft creak from upstairs. Her heart dropped. Someone was in the house. She backed away slowly, her foot brushing against the edge of the counter. Her fingers stretched out, shaking, until they found the knife's handle. It was cold, heavier than she expected. She gripped it tightly, her knuckles whitening. Another creak. This one louder. Closer. It was coming from the staircase. She turned toward the living room, her eyes fixed on the base of the stairs. The shadows seemed to dance there, shifting unnaturally with the flicker of the light. And then a single step, slow, deliberate, would groaned under the weight of someone or something. Her breath caught in her throat. She stepped back, her heel hitting the edge of the rug. A figure emerged, not fully visible, but enough to make her knees weak. Tall, gaunt. The face was shrouded in darkness, but the outline was unmistakable. The shoulders hunched, the head tilted at an unnatural angle. And those eyes, they glimmered faintly, unblinking, piercing through her. A rasping voice filled the air, barely above a whisper. You shouldn't have come back. Her grip on the knife tightened. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure took another step forward, then another. The light above her flickered once, twice, and went out. Darkness swallowed the room. The knife in Laura's hand felt like her only anchor to reality. Her breaths came in quick, panicked bursts, each one louder in the suffocating silence. She couldn't see the figure anymore, but she could feel it. The presence was overwhelming, a suffocating weight pressing down on her chest. A sound broke the silence. Not footsteps this time. Scratching. Slow, deliberate, like nails dragging along wood. It came from everywhere at once. Above her, behind her, beside her. Laura's heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. She turned blindly, holding the knife out in front of her, her arms shaking violently. Who's there? She whispered, her voice cracking. No response. Only the scratching, growing louder, closer. Her mind raced. The front door was behind her, but the thought of turning her back on whatever lurked in the darkness paralyzed her. She took a shaky step back. The floor groaned beneath her, the sound swallowed by the relentless scratching. Leave me alone, she shouted, her voice echoing through the empty house. The scratching stopped. Silence fell, so absolute it was deafening. And then, a low, guttural laugh. It came from the corner of the room. Laura's head snapped toward the sound, but the darkness was impenetrable. The laugh grew louder, deeper, distorted, as though it came from multiple throats at once. She backed away, her heel hitting the wall behind her. Why? The voice rasped, mocking and cruel. Laura swallowed hard, her fingers trembling around the knife's handle. Why, what? She managed to choke out. The voice shifted, moving, circling her. Why did you come back to my house? The words hung in the air like poison, heavy and suffocating. Laura's knees buckled, and she slid down the wall, the knife clattering to the floor. Something moved in the shadows. Closer, closer. And then she saw it. A hand, pale and skeletal, reaching out from the darkness toward her face. The hand stopped inches from her face. Laura stared, paralyzed. unable to even blink. The fingers were impossibly long, bony, with jagged nails that gleamed faintly in the dark. They twitched, flexing as if savoring the moment. The air around her grew colder. Her breath fogged in front of her, each exhale shaking with fear. The hand moved again. Closer. Her instincts screamed at her to move, but her body refused to obey. Her back pressed against the wall as if she could melt into it and disappear. The hand's nails grazed her cheek, cold as ice. It sent a jolt of terror through her, like a shockwave rippling under her skin. "Why are you here?" the voice demanded again, louder this time, filled with venom. Laura's lips parted, but no sound came out. The hand gripped her face now, forcing her to look up into the void. And then the figure leaned in. Its face finally emerged from the shadows. It wasn't human. The skin was stretched too tight over its skull, gray and cracked like old porcelain. Its eyes were hollow sockets, but deep inside them glimmered tiny pinpricks of light, like dying embers. Its mouth twisted into an unnatural grin, revealing rows of sharp, uneven teeth. Laura whimpered, her body trembling violently. The creature tilted its head, observing her like a predator playing with its prey. "You shouldn't have touched what wasn't yours," it hissed, its voice dripping with malice. Touched? Laura's mind reeled, trying to grasp its meaning. The note. The bloody handprint. The knife. The creature leaned closer, its cold breath brushing against her ear. "Now you're mine." Before she could react, the light above flickered violently, bursting with a deafening pop. Glass rained down, and the room plunged into complete darkness. Laura screamed. The sound echoed in the void, swallowed by the shadows. And then came the laughter again. This time, it surrounded her, countless voices laughing in unison, a chorus of torment. Something grabbed her wrist, yanking her into the dark. The knife fell from her hand, clattering uselessly to the floor. Her scream was cut short as the void consumed her, and the house fell silent once more. The silence was unbearable, thick, suffocating. And then, the faintest sound, a dripping, steady, rhythmic, drip, drip, drip. Laura's eyes fluttered open, her head pounding. Her body felt weightless, suspended in an unnatural stillness. The air smelled damp, metallic, and cold. Her fingers twitched, grazing something coarse beneath her. Wood. She was lying on a wooden floor. Slowly, painfully, she sat up, her muscles aching, her joints stiff. The darkness was impenetrable. She reached out blindly, her hands finding only emptiness. The dripping grew louder, echoing in the vast, unseen space around her. Her pulse quickened. She wasn't alone. She could feel it. The presence was stronger now, oppressive, bearing down on her like a physical weight. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "Who's there?" The dripping stopped. The silence was absolute again, crushing her from all sides. And then came the sound of footsteps. Soft at first, barely audible, but growing louder with each step. They were deliberate, purposeful, and getting closer. Laura scrambled backward, her palms slipping on the damp wood. Her breathing grew ragged, her chest heaving with panic. The footsteps stopped abruptly, just a few feet away. She squinted into the void, desperate to see, to understand. A faint glow appeared, like a dying ember floating in the darkness. It pulsed, growing brighter, illuminating a single figure. The same figure, gaunt, hollow-eyed, with that twisted grin carved into its face. It crouched down, bringing its face level with hers. "You wanted the truth," it whispered, its voice low and gravelly. Laura shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, I don't. I don't want this." The creature chuckled, the sound dry and grating, like rusted metal grinding together. "But you asked," it said, leaning closer. Its hollow eyes burned brighter, filling her vision. And now you'll see. The floor beneath her vanished. She plunged into the void, screaming as the darkness swallowed her whole, falling endlessly. The last thing she heard was the creature's laughter, echoing in her mind like a cruel symphony. Laura's screams seemed endless. It spiraled into the abyss, swallowed by the darkness around her. She wasn't falling anymore. She was floating, suspended in a cold, weightless void. The air, or whatever surrounded her, was thick, cloying, impossible to breathe. Her lungs burned. Her limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, as though they weren't hers anymore. A faint glow appeared in the distance. It flickered, weak at first, then grew stronger, casting a sickly green light. Shapes began to take form, twisted, distorted. They surrounded her, shifting and writhing like shadows with minds of their own. She couldn't tell where one ended and another began. Voices whispered from every direction, soft, insistent, calling her name. Laura, Laura, Laura. The sound crawled under her skin, sending shivers through her body. Stop, she cried, her voice breaking, but the whispers only grew louder. They overlapped, turning into a cacophony of disjointed words and phrases. You shouldn't have come. Do you see it now? You can't escape. The light grew brighter, blinding, forcing her to shield her eyes. When it dimmed, she was no longer in the void. She was standing in a room. But it wasn't just any room. It was her childhood bedroom. The pastel walls, the floral curtains, the old stuffed animals on the bed. It was all there, exactly as she remembered it. But something was wrong. The colors were muted, almost gray. The air was thick with the smell of decay. And the bed. The bed was soaked in something dark and sticky. Blood. Her stomach churned as she stepped closer. A figure lay on the bed, motionless. Her heart stopped. It was her own body, pale and lifeless, staring back at her with empty eyes. She stumbled back, her legs giving out beneath her. No, this isn't real. The whispers returned, louder now, more aggressive. It's real, Laura. You can't run from it. The room began to warp, the walls bending inward, the ceiling collapsing. Her dead self sat up, its head snapping toward her with a sickening crack. You belong here now, it said, its voice layered with echoes. The light in the room flickered violently, and the whispers turned into screams. Laura tried to move, to escape, but the floor beneath her turned to liquid, pulling her down. She thrashed, clawing at the air, but it was useless. The last thing she saw was her own lifeless face, grinning as the darkness consumed her once more. The darkness released her, and Laura gasped, her body collapsing onto a cold, hard surface. Her lungs burned as she gulped in air, the sensation sharp and painful. The ground beneath her was smooth and icy, like polished stone. When she opened her eyes, she found herself in a massive, dimly lit chamber. The walls stretched endlessly upward, vanishing into a black void. Pillars carved with strange, ancient symbols surrounded her, glowing faintly with a sickly green hue. The silence was deafening, but it didn't last. The whispers returned, soft and insidious, slithering through the air like snakes. Laura, don't fight it. It's already begun. She staggered to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. Her breath fogged in the freezing air as she turned in frantic circles, searching for an escape. But there was nothing. No doors. No windows. Only the endless stone and the faint glow of the symbols. In the center of the chamber, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs too long and a head that tilted unnaturally to the side. Its hollow eyes burned with the same green light as the symbols, piercing her with their gaze. Welcome, it said, its voice low and reverberating, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. Laura stumbled back, her hands clutching her chest as her heart pounded wildly. "What do you want from me?" she cried, her voice cracking. The figure stepped closer, its movements unnaturally fluid, as though it glided rather than walked. "You sought the truth," it said, stretching a bony hand toward her. "And now you must bear it." The ground beneath her began to shift, the symbols on the floor glowing brighter. She looked down and saw them moving, twisting into new shapes that pulsed with life. Faces began to emerge from the stone, twisted, screaming faces, reaching out toward her with desperate hands. Their voices joined the whispers, a symphony of agony and despair. Laura screamed as the hands clawed at her ankles, pulling her down. "You can't escape what's already inside you," the figure hissed, its grin stretching impossibly wide. As she was dragged into the glowing abyss, the last thing she heard was her own voice joining the chorus of screams. The darkness that swallowed Laura was different this time. It wasn't cold or suffocating. It was strangely calm. The screaming faded, replaced by a deep, endless hum, like the sound of the earth breathing. When Laura opened her eyes, she wasn't in the void anymore. She was standing in a field. The grass stretched endlessly in every direction, shimmering under a golden sky that pulsed with light. The air smelled sweet, like flowers after a storm. It was beautiful, but it didn't feel right. Laura's heart raced as she turned, searching for something, anything, that made sense. Far in the distance, she spotted a figure. It was small, hunched, and completely still. Without thinking, she walked toward it. The closer she got, the more her unease grew. The figure wasn't moving. It was facing away from her, seated in the grass. And then she realized it was her. Again. Her doppelganger sat there, head bowed, hair falling around its face. Laura hesitated, her instinct screaming at her to run. But she stepped closer. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It simply raised its head, revealing its face. It wasn't exactly hers. The features were familiar but twisted, too sharp, too hollow, as though it was a reflection warped by cracked glass. Its eyes glowed faintly, just like the creature's had in the void. "You already know," it said, its voice soft but heavy with meaning. "No," Laura whispered, shaking her head. "You're not me." The doppelganger stood slowly, towering over her despite its frail frame. "I'm what you've tried to bury," it said. "I'm every truth you ignored, every warning you silenced." The golden sky darkened, streaked with crimson, as the grass beneath their feet began to wither. "No," Laura screamed. "This isn't real. This isn't me." The figure smiled faintly, tilting its head. "It's always been you," it said. And then it reached out, pressing its hand to her chest. A warmth spread through her, then pain. A sharp, searing pain that spread like fire through her veins. The world blurred, the golden field dissolving into blackness. When the light returned, Laura was back in her house. The kitchen, the knife, the handprints. But this time, there was only silence. She stood there, clutching her chest, her breath shallow. The house felt different. Empty. She looked at her reflection in the window. Her own face stared back at her, but her eyes glowed faintly. And behind her, in the reflection, the shadows moved.